much, Pastor David. Yeah, that was good. Thank you. Our second speaker this evening is a gentleman by the name of Robert Wendman. Robert is a person who transitioned into a trans woman as a young man, and then transitioned back to the ordinary, extraordinary man that he is today. He was born and raised and has spent most of his adult life in the Guelph area, right? Yes. He is a person who has become a baptized follower of Jesus Christ, and he desires to encourage and help people by sharing his story. He is an extraordinarily courageous man, simply by his willingness to share his story in the present climate of today, when the popularly accepted narrative is that there is no regret and there is no detransitioning. So he's very courageous from that point of view. He is a person I'm very pleased to have met, and even more pleased to call him friend and brother. I have deliberately kept my intro short because I didn't want to take away from his self-telling of his own story. But let us welcome today Robert Wendman.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming tonight. I wasn't sure with the weather out there, plus that street light being out there, that maybe people wouldn't be able to find us here. But I'm very grateful to Boyle and to Dave and for you tonight for coming. And I have to tell a very difficult story for me in my life. And I've got to take you back a few years, back into the 1960s. And as a very young boy, I found myself gender confused. I started secretly cross-dressing, and again in the 1960s, it was very much a very private thing. Now, I was bullied at school. I was one of those kids that grew up kind of, like 6 foot nothing and weighed nothing and uncoordinated and relentlessly teased. So I was also overly sensitive. And I think we know that we hear about bullying, that especially in these days, that can be a prime victim for that kind of thing. But anyway, moving on from that, I guess I went through endless, I would say, years until the 1980s, going through these endless cycles of indulging in, for lack of a better word, would be lust, dressing as a girl, and then purging in shame and remorse. And of course, I made outward attempts to change myself by cutting my hair short, growing a beard when I could, and again, I was starting to party and all that stuff and try and be tough, so I thought. Anyway, I also, again, I had left church, of course, going through the 1970s and the 1980s. It was kind of like, and especially again in the late 60s, a sexual revolution, and of course a revolution about everything. I think we largely exchanged Christian beliefs, and for, again, what Dave touched on was kind of secularism, Darwinism, and most importantly for many of us was the endless proclamations of diversity, inclusiveness, and tolerance. And getting a bit of feedback there. Anyway, I was hired by Canada Post, which had liberal transfer opportunities, and I had opportunities to relocate across the country. And that's better. So I moved out west in Calgary, hoping that I could start a whole new life. You know, and that was surely the answer, that was going to change me, and going out there, everything would be fine. But it wasn't long before I realized my same emotional problems had also come along. I returned to Ontario, and lonely, reluctantly, said, okay, acknowledging I could not shake these urges. And again, at the time, I think that looking around the room, I think some of us can relate to the times of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Things were much different. Things were changing, but anyway, I started to realize I couldn't possibly be the only one in the world with this. Again, feeling so isolated, there was no internet or anything like that. The only resource I had, really what we had, were those magazines that you could find at the top shelf or the variety store, you know, those magazines that was considered for stuff that was forbidden and dark and kinky and all that. And I found a store in Owen Sound, Ontario, of all places, that was called Fantasyland, and it catered to men who liked to dress up as women. And so I thought about it for a while and struck up the courage and decided to visit the store. And once visiting that store, my life was profoundly changed. It seemed that the owner, the proprietor, just was able to pull something out of me. And not only did I realize that I was able to openly buy items of women's clothing, that she also had started a social club for men that like to dress as women and their supporters and followers. And surprisingly, most of these men identifying as cross-dressers had wives and girlfriends, and they seemed to support them. And I wanted to always ask them how the wives and girlfriends, what they really thought of it, but I really didn't know how to say, but how to really come up and ask them, I really couldn't. And some, they often referred to themselves, their cross-dressing activities, as a second self. It sort of came from, there was somebody called Harry Benjamin, or not Harry Benjamin, pardon me, Virginia Prince, who was a cross-dresser and actually was credited for kind of coining the term as transgender, that is, people that want to express themselves as the opposite gender, but not have sex reassignment surgery. But then I met another group of people that were identifying themselves as transsexuals. And many seemed incredibly self-centered, depressed, and suffering from other forms of mental illness. I rationalized these people likely had unstable family backgrounds and possibly victims of society's hatred and intolerance. Meeting others validated my cross-gender desires and initiated my gender sort of transition transformation process to a point where, unlike those people I referred to as the cross-dressers who could put themselves aside, I was becoming confused. I was unable to really separate the fantasy from the reality. And, you know, I had tried to date women in the past, but I was so insecure about myself that my dates were just disastrous. So I guess in reality, instead of meeting a woman for love and marriage and perhaps children, I was focused on becoming a woman. And seemed to be aided and abetted by a lot of those talk shows were coming out, and you know, mass media that was just portraying the one-sided sympathetic views of people going into this behavior. And again, no contrary evidence was ever, or testimony was ever mentioned. So I began to change my thinking from shame and guilt to reasoning my cross-gender behavior was completely natural for me. This despite being 6'2", with large extremities, and no other physical reasons or rationale that I too had to be a woman, a male, trapped in a woman's body. And I also saw as a solution that perhaps transitioning was the real issue, that why I was having emotional problems such as the inferiority complexes and the feeling of worthlessness. So I decided that it might be worth pursuing this, that really this could be the solution to all my emotional problems. So again, I rapidly lost weight. I one time got myself heavy, my lifestyle. I was kind of doing a lot of drinking, partying, and all that kind of stuff. And I grew my hair long, and I shaved my body hair and pierced my ears at the time. And in the kind of 1980s, early 1990s, I sort of had that androgynous rock star look, you know, you get the big hair bands and things like that. But then some of my TS transsexual friends recommended the doctor, because at the time it was not easy to get a doctor to prescribe me female hormones. And so they gave me a name of a doctor, and sure enough I got a prescription for what is known as conjugated estrogen, which is given to women. It's known as Premarin, which women it's commonly given to for going through menopause, and there is controversy with it. I think that women know about the risk of breast cancer. But anyway, so I could have danced in the streets. My voyage was on the way. I was on the road to a new life. And I went for a clinical assessment, and at the time, this is 1990, I went to the Clark, which is now known as CAMH, Gender Identity Clinic, and it was much different. I felt almost like as a sexual deviant, and I went through a clinical psychiatric evaluation, and it was tough because they asked you everything. And as I say, I went through all kinds of tests and saw all these different doctors, but fortunately they recommended me to a psychiatrist in Waterloo who was more understanding of transsexual people. Again, I'm using some of these terms, don't confuse you, but because who then, I'm a little nervous, sorry, he kind of was more encouraging and said, yes, you are a transsexual, and sort of encouraged me to take the gradual steps to becoming a woman and eventually going for sex reassignment surgery. So my hormone regimen, then I actually went on birth control pills. I was, and that really, started to change me. I started actually growing breasts and going, wow. And my male sexuality, if you will, kind of went, it was, kind of went to physical sleep. It really changed. So then I also had to go for electrolysis sessions to get my beard taken off, and that was painful. And but again, I saw it as necessary. Then, of course, in 1994 now, I did the most biggest step in my life. According to the Harry Benjamin Standards of Care, a person that wants to go through, that is sort of the gold standard, if you will, for gender transition, you had to cross-live in your opposite gender before surgery. So in 1994, I took probably the biggest step in my life at the time, and started cross-living and changed all my identification, and became a woman, essentially identifying as a woman. And again, being employed at Canada Post, we have a very powerful union, a public sector union. If anybody's familiar with public sector unions, you know they hold a lot of power now. And they put my needs forward to management for, at the time it was called an accommodation. And coincidentally, there was another person there that was considered a non-transsexual. That is, they were living as a woman, but they were unable to fulfill going through having the surgery. So we had to get an accommodation at the time for a separate washroom. So we did that, and initially I did receive hostility. There was threats, and people wouldn't talk to me, and it was scary. But for the most part, it actually, the tension faded away, and the next thing you know, there I was living out in the world, and I'd done it, I was Rebecca, and I just was heading up to cloud nine, if you will. And then in 1996, going back to the Clark, having fulfilled the criteria of the Harry Benjamin Standards of Care, I was recommended for sex reassignment surgery. And the surgeon was in England. That's who they were using at the time. And fortunately, I guess I had relatives over there. And my mom actually went with me to have the surgery. And I was so fortunate that I had my family in the end, because I don't know where I would be if I didn't have my family. But it was tough. I mean, I know I heard my parents, being their eldest son, who went through hurt, but again, I was so fortunate to have a loving family. So I had the liberating, life-saving sex reassignment surgery, and I was considered fully a woman with female identity completely, and as I say, I was mission accomplished. It was almost like I've done it, and I was on an emotional high, and excuse me, and my personal happiness was now confirmed as my outer body was supposed to be in harmony with my inner self. However, I was eventually discovered that I was only enjoying the pleasures of sin for a season. I found myself constantly pining for acceptance and affirmation, feeling tolerated but becoming constricted by intensifying emotional insecurities and fear of discovery, shame, embarrassment, and humiliation. I was coming to feel as a manufactured counterfeit, an imposter, and I found myself like my intense emotional insecurities were actually becoming amplified. They were coming back. I realized a little chance for love, companionship, or marriage, and again, I regretted being unable to see my own children, to be married, and say, I'm now in my 60s, and probably many of you there might have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. I'm exactly as I was when I moved out at 21. I have no kids, and never will. And so that I started to really, I grieved it for quite a while. And again, I just realized that I was constantly pining for this affirmation, and people saying, yeah, that's great. Well, perhaps any strange look, or it could make me feel depressed for days. And I found myself really becoming a prisoner of fear and going, well, how can this be? I mean, I'm really a woman. Right, so I thought. But what was happening was I was experiencing a spiritual death. And I was uncomfortable in my own skin because I was trying to believe and support something factually untrue. I was trying to blame, I think many people will say, as what they touched on, that we blame a hateful and intolerant society for all things, but I started to realize that I was blaming hatred and intolerant society, but really it was my own conscience within me that was in guilt, and it was becoming amplified, and I was being convicted and chastened, and I started to think of God almost as a last resort, because by this time I had promoted to a supervisor. At one time, I was now in Toronto, but unfortunately, without the powerful union protection, I found myself just being wound up in a battle of fear, and I was unable to address employees, and to address problems, and of course, subsequently, I was asked to leave with a reduced pension and settlement. So here I was, again, just the lowest of low, and concluding that, I had squandered my life, that I was still, I'd gone nowhere, that as what David touched on with Walter Heyer, and by the way, I have a testimony on his side, that my sex change hadn't done a thing. And again, I started to think of God, and realizing that God chastens who he loves. And I started to realize that I was a creature of God. Like, God loves me and God wanted me, and I needed to realize I could never again, being years away from church and kind of living in a secular mindset, I had got away from that, and I had even tried to go to some therapists and all that, but I found myself educating them, and it really didn't help. So I was at a very low point now. I was back in Guelph now, having not working anymore and being put out to pasture, as you will, early retired at 53, and just going, where do I go? And then I just started thinking of the Lord and just started realizing that perhaps that all that stuff that I had rejected for years, that all that Christian bigotry and all that stuff, well, maybe that is right. And so I actually dared to open a Bible for myself and started listening, and I learned that my body, like as a believer, is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And I also realized too that that being a temple of the Spirit, that living as a woman was in fact living in a false identity, and that God sees me exactly as who I am, regardless of hormones, surgery, legal proclamation. I guess I am exactly who God created me to be. I had realized I was as the clay saying to the potter, why did you make me this way? Where God had said that, no, this is who you are. And I really thought at the time that there was no hope for me, that was it. But then I started to realize, to start to understand that God really does love me, and He sent His Son to die on the cross for my sins. And that by believing on Him, I could have my sins forgiven. And that just instead of having a life of uncertainty and just bouncing from not knowing what to do, surviving, literally like lost in that stormy sea, I had a life with the Lord, that the Lord loves me, and He was by His substitutionary death on the cross, and that I was adopted into His family, that I was His, I belonged to God. And again, I realized that I could not continue living as a woman. It was false, and that we know that we often refer to those that are believers here tonight as the Holy Spirit of truth. And the Spirit of truth was telling me that, of course, I had to be who I was, a man. And I am a man, and despite all the legal proclamations and surgical and all that stuff, I was exactly as God created me. And rather than being angry and confused, I became thankful for who I am and what God has given me. And again, I just find myself now just so much happier, like living in truth. Truth really does make you free. And, so many people, especially as we talk tonight, are starting to live this way. But they're angry. They're, as I say, it's become very toxic out there. Like we have to be here tonight. We have to go, wow, is there a risk? Like what if somebody finds out? People, again, it's really saying it's courageous to have this, and yet we have to be courageous to talk about the truth. And so, anyway, the Lord led me to repentance, that I had to repent of this, and I did. I gave a testimony of baptism and was baptized by immersion at Royal City Baptist Church, for which I'm a member. In conclusion, I guess that our society, unfortunately now this transgender thing, it's really a catch-all term, because at one time when we think of where to be a transgender, you were just going in for surgery. There's now I mean, I've lost track of it, I think there's like 56 different genders or something. And essentially, you can self-proclaim yourself as the gender you might want to be without surgery or hormones. You can say, I'm a woman, and that's it, or I'm a man. And legally, you can do that. And now I think, you can get an X, I think, on your birth certificate for gender, so you don't have to have a gender anymore. But unfortunately, what I'm finding that what's being told now through, social media and the internet is that essentially a lot of the same stories that I believed myself years ago that hadn't changed. And I've found from my witness, because I've talked to other people, I have done some work with the ministry in the United States called Help for Families, and that's for people that have friends, loved ones, or themselves going through these issues and have nowhere to come. And just hearing people, the brokenheartedness of this, and what it's done to see maybe people lose their father, or people lose their mother to all of a sudden say, I'm a man, or I'm a woman, and or children. It was really hard. And again, as what you mentioned, Dave, that right now it seems like doctors almost have to go along with saying that this is, yes, you are transgender and have to prescribe hormones, or else they could be in fear of being taken for discrimination and possibly losing their medical license to practice. But my witness, of many others, indicates that the more, it seems to be the more that we proclaim the freedom to cross gender lines, or that old saying that gender is but a psychological construct is wrong, it's contrary. We were born, God says we were born male or female. Now there are some medical exemptions, there truly are people that have issues being intersex, but it is far a rare thing. And unfortunately, I think activism has kind of overwhelmed it. I think kind of said, well, yeah, here we go. And so over recent years, they've kind of tried to take this big umbrella and fold it into this term of transgender. And but what I found, again, meeting many others in time, I actually had to say goodbye to it all because just nobody was happy. Like, despite maybe some were successful, and we have a society that says, essentially that if you believe you're the opposite sex to which you were born, you can be that. And yet so many people are unhappy. So many people are angry. Like, again, I have to bring up that fear issue of, we're afraid to tell the truth because the feelings have overridden, truth. And sometimes I think of like, for people's parents, if your children were doing something bad or harmful, you'd want to say, I think this is bad or harmful. But now there's actually cases where, I believe the education system, I heard, and doctors are actually overriding parents. And again, of course, there's the sex ed curriculum being taught in school. And while maybe perhaps there's nothing wrong in that, we certainly do need compassion and understanding. But I found that we also need truth. And we need the truth and love. And especially in the state that we live in, it just seems that feelings have overwhelmed truth and biological reality. And it's very concerning because you just wonder. But again, I know that having Christ in my life, I know that He's the way, the truth, and the life. And I know that, one day that, He's going to come again. And I also can be assured that many people will, hopefully, will come along. But again, we've got to be careful. I found that, that doing this is transgender or changing sex, it is serving an idol. And that may sound hard, but for those who choose to cross gender lines comes an expectation for a life filled with serious mental and physical consequences, not only harming self, but loved ones, friends, many others, and of course, society. We're being forced to accept something that is factually untrue. And again, I just want to say that we are all sinners. Certainly don't think of myself as I still have many sins and realize that I always will be a sinner, but I can think as I look at my poppy here from remembrance of the soldiers, I look back at the cross and realize that I remember what Jesus did for me. And I hope that He do the same for you in your life. I thank you.